Okay, it's great to see everybody. We're here today for the launch of another heavy book. The Routledge Handbook of the Northern Ireland Conflict and Peace. This is one of a series of many handbooks that Routledge have produced over the years. And they're all about the same price as well. I should say it's a cast of pretty much everybody, pretty much every contributor going. Malachi Doherty said to me, everybody's in it, and he's not wrong. And so we're going to hear from both the editors and some of the contributors today, hopefully wrapping up about 5-ish after a lot of meaningful questions to bombard the speakers with. I should say that this is one of many events PRONI hosts over the course of the year. This year, 24-25, we're branding the whole year as celebrating inclusion. I nearly forgot this. Celebrating inclusion and diversity in the archives. And we're running with that theme all the way through to March 2025. And it's a perfect fit for this book. Before I ask Laura to speak, I just want to say a few words of housekeeping just to really cheer everybody up. PRONI has no parking, so anybody outside is paying display, so hopefully you'll have paid a display or come by bicycle or on foot. There's no planned alarm. If one happens, just follow myself across to the ARC apartments. Toilets are outside in the atrium, and that's the lot for housekeeping. We are filming, it's not going live, but it'll go out on the PRONI YouTube video in due course. So it's my pleasure to ask Laura to come and speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much everyone for coming this evening. And our contributors, most importantly, we're so glad to see so many of you. So we thought that we'd mention briefly, what the idea was behind doing this handbook, and one of them was that there is no, even though there is a lot of Routledge handbooks, as we all know, there is no handbook of the Northern Ireland conflict or peace process, and so we thought this was the big problem in terms of how much Northern Ireland became a central focus in academia and British-Irish politics, particularly after Brexit. And mainly my annoyance of Brexit was something that kind of pushed us to think about this, about how important Northern Ireland was and how important it is that people know more about the conflict and more about how complex it was. And one of the things that also is a little bugbear of mine is that how many of these discussions of Northern Ireland and the conflict are associated with just historical and political science approaches, and what we wanted to do was bring all these other disciplines in as well. So we cover lots of different disciplines, including our diversity of people who are contributors here. Even just looking, we've got like English literature and theatre studies, we've got geography, we've got journalism, management. We do have historians as well, so we didn't try and cut them all out. But we wanted to show that there's lots of different ways of engaging with Northern Ireland. There's lots of different ways of understanding it. And we wanted to open up that discussion. We don't really believe there is one history of Northern Ireland or the Northern Irish conflict. There's lots of different perspectives, lots of different ways to understand it. And we wanted different people to take different approaches to how they wrote about it. We sat down in lockdown over Zoom. We hadn't actually met in person by this stage, so Martin was in Derry, I was in Denmark, and we decided to create a big wish list of all the people we would like to contribute to the volume, and thankfully all these people decided they would, and we're very grateful for during a lot of very stressful times for a lot of us. They actually wrote about these subjects for us. And what we wanted people to do was to write about subject matters that they were experts in, that they cared about. We wanted them to pick their own chronology so they could decide to start as early as they wanted to. And people like Joanne, who was writing about policing, went right back to the start of the state. Some people started in 1968, others started later. And people could go as long as they wanted. They could write to present day, they could finish with 1998, whatever they decided to do. And the importance was that there was a diversity. We didn't want to give any framework that people had to stick to. We also decided that people could use whatever terminology they wanted as well. So again, we didn't want to create this kind of template that everyone had to follow. So there's Northern Ireland's Norths of Ireland, and this wee place, whatever euphemism people wanted to use, we were allowed anyone. And actually some people including Caroline McGuinness, decided she was going to use different terms the whole way through it. She wasn't going to stick to one, and that was absolutely fine as well. And we decided to take lots of different approaches, some of them which were quite micro, that people decided to study particular personalities like John Hume, some people decided to study particular events. And we did ask, like a lot of our contributors have a long experience of working in Northern Ireland and on Northern Ireland, so we asked people if they've been working on this for a long time to reflect on what they've learned over that period of time, to reflect on how their ideas might have changed. And actually I think one of the big successes of the volume is getting this very personal interpretation as well of people like Graham Dawson, who's been worked for a long time in Northern Ireland, who reflected on his family background as an English person whose mother was born, I think in South Armagh, definitely along the border somewhere, and how that kind of reflected through his ideas about the Troubles, and also how that changed over the course of time. And that meant that we found out a lot about our contributors as well as the readers know that, you know, we're all people who come from different places and we have different ways of studying the world. So that was kind of some of the things that we actually wanted to bring in, is to move away from this idea that these are all like, there's only one way to do any of these studies. There's actually lots of ways to do them, and we all bring our own personal approaches to these. And we're really grateful for people to you know, give us their stories as well, to talk about their experiences. Also Brian, who I thought also did a really you know, really fantastic job of doing this stuff. So the themes that we covered in the book, we have 45 chapters, of which we have 2 chapters at the start, which are an introduction and a kind of overview of the Troubles that Martine wrote, and we both wrote the introduction together. And then everything else is divided into these themes. And amazingly, the themes actually kind of stayed from before the book till after the book. And anyone who's edited a book will know that hardly ever happens. You tend to write things that then decide to dissipate and become something else, and you have to move everything around. But essentially we wanted to talk about, you know, kind of Northern Ireland, the conflict, the peace process, and the debates and controversies that still survive around that. So we talked about, you know, difficult issues around collusion, around you know, different political ideologies from different organisations, and you know, things that often get left out, like gender, like how women experience the Troubles, you know, how class inflected through it, which often don't get written about. We have environment and everyday. That's something I'm particularly interested in as someone who studies material culture. I'm really interested in everyday experiences of the Troubles and not just focusing on big events. Protagonists and participants, strategies and aftermath. And these last 3 sections were really something I was very keen to include, which is around reflective practice, so people thinking about their position, thinking about the work they've done. Heritage and memory, and though this comes from working in PRONI, but also working with museums and heritage institutions, is how we remember the Troubles is not exactly the same thing as what happened in it. So how that, you know, gets brought into institutional memory, what things get remembered, what things get forgotten, are actually quite important. And again, allowing these creative responses, how is theatre, how is music, how is other types of you know, creative practices actually engage with these issues, and often being quite successful at talking about things that we can't really talk about otherwise. So I'm going to let Martine speak soon, but we just thought we couldn't really kind of finish the introduction without talking about, you know, again, how live and political these issues are in terms of the big debates that are happening at the minute in Irish history around the Legacy Act, and particularly the creation of an expert history committee around creating these official or public histories of British policy in Northern Ireland, and these ongoing debates that are going on through newspapers and letters. You know, one of our colleagues in Queen's, obviously Professor Coleman, is like really important in having these discussions. I have to say I have strong agreement with a lot of her issues she's brought up. But we wanted to think about this in the context of how this type of work differs from what we are doing with bringing together a handbook like this. Like I worked in PRONI and I really enjoyed my time working in PRONI. I worked in Access, and one of my jobs was actually to go to government departments and look at their classified files and decide what should be open and what is closed. So I have quite a good insight into what that entails. And what I find is, like, you know, government documents are so diverse. There's so many things you find that you expect, so many things you don't find, so many things you know, don't expect to find that are in there, that it's actually a really difficult job. Like, to create any kind of official history, there has to be some kind of control mechanism put on that. And so, you know, the historians who will have that job are going to have a pretty difficult job to do it. But essentially, you know, what we want to do is move beyond official histories to allow people to use archives, but also use a lot of other different mechanisms for actually understanding and sourcing their understandings of what happened. We're really keen on the ideas of academic freedom. So one of the things that Marie Coleman has brought up in this letter is that the problem with official histories that are government controlled is that the government control copyright. So if they don't like what you write, they don't have to publish it. So that's going to be an issue in terms of academic freedom and what they are able, even if they're able to access stuff, will they be able to publish it? And we were very keen that all our contributors could have their own perspective in their chapters. I hope everyone agrees that we didn't try and pressure anybody to say anything they didn't want to say. Like, we were actually really keen to acknowledge everyone's expertise and allow contradictions and allow debates within those chapters and outside of those chapters, that people didn't have to have the same interpretation of even the same material. And just the importance of having different approaches, that we all have different ways of different disciplinary ways of engaging. We have different methods, we have different sources, and they will sometimes bring us to the same conclusions and sometimes bring us to different conclusions, and that's actually really important. It allows a vibrant area of study rather than something that's closed down and contained and controlled. So I'm going to hand over to Martin to finish, and then we will hand over to our contributors to talk about their chapters.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I think you sort of covered most of what I was going to talk about, really. But yeah, I think the only other thing, there's a few other small things I might just add in, because I know these came up when we had an earlier kind of launch at the McGee College, or the Derry Londonderry campus, I should say. It's been rebranded of my former university, the University of Ulster, also rebranded now as Ulster University for quite a few years, I think. But so was the cover, there's a few people asked about the cover. We had to sort of kind of search around for different covers, and we had to look at a few different options. It's difficult sometimes because you have to kind of pay for these images, and publishers aren't always the most generous or forthcoming when it comes to paying for them. But we alighted on this one just sort of searching on their image banks, really, and the picture is of the Northern Ireland border with the Republic of Ireland, obviously, but it's of an art installation that was kind of done by Rita Duffy, and somebody's taken a photograph of it with someone passing by with the umbrellas. You can see multicoloured umbrellas. The art installation, or the project, was named Soft Border, and was very much kind of created with the kind of idea of the debates on about Brexit and a kind of post-Brexit Northern Ireland, and that sort of debate. So we thought, in the sense of that, the currency of that debate would probably be quite a good thing to have as a kind of cover, but also in the sense in which it seems to speak a little bit to some of the themes of diversity that Laura was talking about, that we were attempting to try and reach in some ways with the book and trying to kind of cover. When we kind of sat down to discuss it, I think we thought, well, we need to have a class perspective, we need to have a gender perspective, we need to look at issues of disability and homosexuality, and things that aren't normally kind of covered, or certainly don't strike your mind when you think of a book that's going to relate to the conflict here, Stephen mentioned at the start about it being called a handbook. It's actually, that's a publisher thing, really, I should explain. We don't claim it to be a handbook, it's just the sort of branding, if you like, of the publisher to kind of call it that. I think we initially were going to go with the Troubles, and then I think the publisher probably decided it would have more saleability or recognisability or whatever globally, in terms of marketing or whatever, I assume, if it was called something more clearly badged as the Northern Ireland conflict. Not everybody knowing perhaps about that term that we use for it, really, So I kind of wanted to explain just a little bit of that, really, Says Laura's pretty much kind of covered, I think, everything else. The one thing I kind of will say that I said at the earlier lunch at McGee was that when you kind of set out in a kind of project like this, there's a lot of people I think would kind of say you're a bit kind of mad to kind of do it, to try and attempt to sort of draw a line. I think it's only in very recent times, particularly historians have even begun to look at the idea of approaching the Troubles as past rather than present or ongoing. The massive amount of stuff that was written about the Troubles over the years, I think really was written live. You know, it was written as it was still an ongoing situation, and to sort of pause and to kind of look back, I think is a very kind of recent thing, you know. And it happened in the context of obviously these discussions about legacy. I mean, there's been a hiatus in that obviously because government was suspended, Storm House Agreement was sort of suspended, nothing was really kind of moving, you know. But in some ways I think that might have been an impetus to us really, you know, to try and have gave us an opportunity to try and kind of collect together a number of people, really kind of diverse and strong kind of talents in different areas and ideas and things to say that we kind of wanted to, thought it was a great opportunity here to try and communicate that really, you know. And maybe try and, in a small ways, kind of academic stuff generally does, percolates, doesn't it, over a long time really, so try and hopefully enlighten or, you know, encourage elements of that debate really, you know, in some ways, in a sort of modest way really, you know, I think. So that was kind of a big part of what motivated us to do it, and to have the sort of multidisciplinary approach to it. And we had some robust debates between us, I think, about, and Laura, I have to say, as a co-editor, has been excellent to work with. She really has kind of challenged, I have to say, my notions as a historian about the limitations of modern discipline. Oftentimes, when you're only talking to other historians, you know, we're all a bit in a silo, we're all a wee bit defensive, you know. Actually, humanities has been under attack, as we know, for a very long time in the UK, and to a certain extent, I think, in Ireland as well. And I mean, maybe part of that makes us a bit defensive as a discipline. I don't know, can't speak for every historian, but I mean, I know that Laura's sort of perspectives as an archaeologist and as a contemporary archaeologist really challenged a lot of my ideas about history, you know, and I think, well, are we really like that? Are historians that conservative? Well, I suppose to the sense we probably are a bit, you know, everybody's in their trench, working in their own area, and I think that's, you know, that's something that a book like this can really kind of help you sort of, it's about perspective, isn't it? It's about getting you to stand back a bit and look at the past and look at the present and look at, you know, all these sort of different forms of history that we try and produce really, you know. So I think that's, for me, that was really the most worthwhile thing about doing the book really, I think, personally, you know. So I think that's really all I've got to say. I think there's anything else to add.
Well, the only thing, sorry, I would add, just before we hand over to our contributors, is that the really nice thing about this book launch is that we don't expect anyone to buy the book because it's a monster and it costs £215 on the Amazon or whatever. And these are really bought by libraries, like they're reference books, so anybody, you know, your nearest library, you can petition them to buy it. You know, so it's really just to hear our contributors. We will leave the copies at the wine reception. Anybody can look through them if they want to, so you can see what kind of stuff's in there. But a lot of these are downloadable by individual chapters by libraries, so that's kind of how they expect people to, you know, engage with them. And yeah, so it means that we're like one of the only people who actually have a physical copy of this book, because most people do not ever own one. But if anyone wants to spend £215, you're welcome to it. But we did not expect anyone to do that. So just, you can have a nice glass of wine at the end, not feel guilty about not buying the book. So I just think then we'll hand over to our contributors, and we ask them all just to talk for a few minutes, like 5 minutes or so, about what their chapter is about, and then, you know, and how they engaged with the process, how they thought about what they were doing, whatever they want to talk about. Again, we're not trying to control this, and then we can open up for any questions or anything else at the end. So Malachi, do you want to start?
Okay. Yeah.
There's a microphone there as well.
Oh, just from here?
Yeah, if you want to do it from there, there's a microphone, so not everybody has to get up.
Yeah.
Might be easier.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, my name is Malachi O'Doherty. I'm a journalist and I grew up in Belfast, born in Donegal. I've dabbled in academia, but not really. I mean, journalism is my background, journalism is my profession, and journalism is my method. The chapter that I've done here is sort of reflecting on the experience of being a journalist within Northern Ireland during a troubled time. I lived in Riverdale in 1972. Riverdale was a centre of very heavy IRA activity. Bobby Story was from Riverdale. The Glen Holmes were Riverdale people. There were safe houses within sight of my front door. The 7 guys who came off the Maidstone prison ship in January of '72 were billeted in safe houses in Riverdale. So, and at the same time, I was working as a reporter on the Sunday News. So I was I was already between two worlds, in the sense that as a journalist, you were expected to have some kind of detachment, even objectivity, around the activities that were happening within your own, inside your own home at times. Because there were occasions when I remember one guy coming to the back door because he was only 16 and he had a Lee Enfield 303 and he jammed it, and he was afraid that he was going to get slapped around the lugs by his OC for messing up one of the guns. So we let him into the house so he could sort out the rifle on the living room floor. Things like that were happening quite often. So my piece in the book is about that split life, if you like, because meeting the IRA on the street at a time when the state was a no-go area, where they were completely open about carrying weapons, and these were clearly visible, and at the same time going into a newspaper office, which was part of the newsletter group, which was a very strongly unionist paper, and daily calling police press office, army press office, and trying to get details on stories and so on. So that's the background to it. I home in on a few core stories here to illustrate the problems of this notion of objectivity and personal involvement. I mean, a very simple thing would be you would be out covering a riot or an incident, and you'd be chatting to an English journalist, and he'd be picking your brains, or you'd be picking his brains, and then the army would come along, and suddenly the English guy can be matey with the soldier, and I can't be matey with the soldier, either because I don't want to be matey with him, or because he's going to be suspicious of a local person in a way that he's not going to be suspicious of somebody with an English accent. At the heart of the chapter is a story of one of the Maidstone escapees, Tommy Gorman. In about 12 years ago, Tommy was an irritant in my life in Riverdale, and I was afraid of him, and I was afraid of the people around him. In later years, we became friendly, and he became a useful contact. And so there's a discussion around what is this relationship between the journalist and the contact, and to what extent does the contact become a friend? How close can you get to people? And Tommy and I got quite close. I remember one night, for instance, we were at the American consul's party. We both were guests there, and it was all great crack. Tommy was showing how, when he was on the dirty protest, he'd torn up the sponge mattress in his cell and dabbed his own feces on the wall, and he was entertaining them all with great stories about this. And then I get an approach first of all, from a woman called Libby Dornan. Libby was a neighbour of mine whose boyfriend, Terry Herdman, had been killed by the IRA as an informer, right? And she had basically gone back to the IRA, got some clarification from them that he wasn't actually an informer, but he was a liability. And Libby said, look, could you introduce me to Tommy Gorman so that I can find out more about this? So we ended up going to Donegal to meet Tommy, and Tommy denying, of course, that he knew anything about him. And then a couple of years later, well, not even a couple of years later, George Larmour, whose brother was an IRA, or was a RUC man, who was off duty minding the family ice cream shop in the Lisburn Road. And George had heard my interview with Tommy Gorman around the Terry Herdman killing, and he came to me and he said, well, look, the police questioned Tommy Gorman about the murder of my brother, and I would like to meet him and ask him, So okay, and I go to Tommy and say, Tommy, and this is an extremely weird situation which, undermines any prospect of a relationship being defined as merely formal contact journalist arrangement or an amicable friendship either, And so that kind of way in which, that kind of ambiguous way and stressful way in which the journalist interacts with contacts and sources and with friends, and how they become confused with each other is very much at the heart of the article. So it's a longer article than that. It's a memoir piece. It's about going through a career in journalism and coming to a sense that there really isn't an objective space or an objectivity that you can take. But I commend it to you as a riveting piece of writing. And if you can't afford that, much of the same, you can read some of my other books, which are really excellent reading as well. Thank you very much.
And a lot cheaper than this one, I think Malachy really wants to say. My name's Joanne Murphy. I did as Laura said, the chapter on policing in Northern Ireland.
Attention please. The search room and reading room will close in 15 minutes. Please finish off your research for this evening. Thank you.
Will the bicycle shed
That tells us everything we need to know. So anyway, I did the chapter on policing, and I suppose mine actually, in hindsight, having listened to Malachy, sounds an awful lot less interesting than I thought it was originally. But what the chapter really tries to do is, I suppose, a number of things. First of all, it tries to, as Laura has said, tell the story of policing in Northern Ireland in terms of the narrative arc of that story, from the foundation of the RUC through the patent process, through the establishment of the PSNI, and to some extent kind of where we are now. But what it also tries to do is to situate that story within the kind of conflict space and the reality of the conflict space. And so the chapter begins with a quote, which I just think is a brilliant quote from Anna Burns' book Milkman, which obviously is so related to the conflict and the reality of communities in the Troubles. And that quote relates to the police, and what the main character in Anna Burns' book says about the police is, in my community, nobody ever called the police, because the only time you would call the police is if you were going to shoot them, and the police knew this, and so they didn't come. And so that was it. And I just thought that was a brilliant quote, in that it encapsulated so many of the sort of difficulties and challenges around policing at that time. And then the other thing which I've tried to kind of do in the chapter, and which I think is really, really important, is to try to look at the organisational perspective here in terms of this conflict and peace process. Because one of the things I think that we see a lot of is we see political accounts, and we see a lot of community accounts, and we're beginning to see more cultural accounts and personal accounts of the conflict. But we don't see organisational accounts. And yet organisations are tasked with actually delivering the peace a lot of the time. So this organisation that we're sitting in has been really significant and instrumental in that process. When we think about, I really hope that's not my phone, but when we think about the reality of what the police had to kind of do and kind of move through in terms of the peace process, much of that was organisational in focus. So I've tried to take people through that organisational account and that organisational process, and look at some of the issues that exist within it that are of particular interest to me. And those generally situate around the management of change, how change is delivered, and how change is led, and we tend, when we think about leadership, not to talk about individuals, kind of heroic leaders. We tend to talk about leadership as more of a collective process. And so the chapter hopefully tries to do that. But it's very important, I suppose, to say that it also talks about some of the successes in that change process around policing, but also some of the failures, and there were significant failures, and more importantly, the stuff that is still to be done, And I deeply regret that the chapter does not include a reflection on blue lights. Okay, I missed that, so that's mea culpa, that's my fault. But anybody who has been watching Blue Lights, and I did a piece on it recently for the BBC, so I had to watch it, I had to skim through it very quickly. But one of the things that I think it did, in fairness to it very well, was that it talked about some of the legacy issues that policing still has to deal with. So anyone that's been watching the news, even in the past few days, in terms of Spotlight, will see that there are very significant issues. And so I suppose the chapter ends with a bit of a reflection on the work that is still to do, and that is very serious, very difficult work, and will be very difficult organisationally and personally. So that's kind of what my chapter does.
Right, I'm Diane Kirby, and I'm chapter 44, Religious Women in the Troubles, an Oral History. And I want to say how delighted I am to be included in the handbook, because it feels like a vindication for the contributors who went from being wholly omitted from the history of the Northern Ireland conflict to now, thanks to the volume, being part of mainstream Troubles history. I'm also pleased because the bulk of my career was devoted to the Cold War. Indeed, the project actually started because of a Cold War study. So there's a personal satisfaction as well as getting recognition in the second field. The chapter is based on a small-scale history project that recorded groups of religious women in conversation, recalling their memories of serving in working-class communities that bore the brunt of the violence. I was advised early on by a BBC journalist, as was Maggie Scull, author of a prize-winning book on Northern Ireland and the Troubles. The Northern Ireland Catholic Church and the Troubles. She was advised by a priest that religious women played no part in the Troubles at all. Now, because I was a Cold War historian with a particular interest in the religious dimension, I was aware of the presence of religious women in wars the world over, and hence not the slightest deterred. Now, if the research had done nothing more than register their presence as players alongside a host of other marginalised women in working class areas where historians, whose histories were for a long time neglected, that would have been quite sufficient. After all, documenting the stories of the absent, the overlooked and the silenced has been a key factor in the Northern Ireland peacemaking process. I knew about this morning. That's fine. I'm having to use my laptop. So what actually happened is, as I said, I would have been quite content just for them to have a little bit of history recorded, but it turned out that there was a lot more to it. The chapter examines how religious women became party to personal, societal and political reconciliation, critical agents for change and effective peace builders from community level upwards. Religious women were involved in secret talks that took place under the auspices of the Redemptorist priests at Clonard Monastery. They were involved in facilitating negotiations with imprisoned combatants. They were conduits between paramilitaries and politicians. Now, a notable distinction between my Cold War research and that into religious women was that the former were high-ranking ecclesiastical diplomats involved in national and global affairs. It was realpolitik writ large. Christian values and personal faith were notably absent from their deliberations. In stark contrast, religious women talked freely and frankly about the importance of faith and that of love, a concept I was deeply uncomfortable with as a tool of analysis. But historians have to work with the evidence, and its explanatory power proved compelling. In particular, the biblical injunction to love your enemies. For the evangelical Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Leslie Carroll, it was a command she had to obey. It led her into partnership with Father Alec Reid, acknowledged as critical to the peace process, and to working with high-ranking members of the IRA to promote negotiations with various parties who preferred their communications not be known. The same command led Methodist Sheila Livingstone into Longkesh on a similar trajectory. Religious women recalled personal pain and loss, fear and frustration, anger and despair, insisting always that working with people was a privilege and that working class communities trying to transcend the conflict and raise families under and amidst violence were the real heroes. It was their stories religious women considered most needed to be recorded. They themselves had little concern about their place in the historical record. Their one wish was to be remembered for staying with the people. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm Bryony Reid, and my chapter is called Meeting Place in the reflective section of the book. So I'm coming from a kind of visual arts and cultural geography background, and I've always been interested in what place means to people. And that interrogation of belonging in place comes very much from my own discomfort and difficulties in securing the sense of belonging I wanted to have on the island of Ireland when I was younger. So that has led to making artwork and to academic research and publications, and then more recently a kind of personal essay practice more than academic writing, but still usually preoccupied with relationships to place. So when I was invited to contribute a chapter to this book, it felt like a real privilege, so thank you, Laura and Marcin. And thinking then about the request to focus on the changes in my understanding of the conflict and peace here over the time that I've been looking at it and working on it, my mind went to the places that I've lived in. So born and reared in Northern Ireland, did a year of study in England, moved to the Republic of Ireland, and then back in Northern Ireland in the last decade or so. So I was deciding then to write about these locations, both in the sense of place and self, locations of self, as a way of examining and exploring the conflict and the peace through the lens of place and my particular kind of personhood in place, and working out really what had changed in me and around me in those different places over the course of my lifetime. So it's very personal, it's very specific and grounded, and for that reason limited in all the ways you would expect. And I found then that the act of writing about these places really drew out an understanding that kind of emerged through doing it rather than, you know, structuring it from the start. And I was beginning by writing my sense impressions of the places, each of the places I've lived in from childhood to the present day. So what I remembered and was presently seeing and hearing and touching and smelling, and then thinking about how I would interpret and understand those sense impressions in the context of identity, belonging, conflict and peace, the identity of the place and then my own identity as well, which for me are entwined. And then those interpretations are also shaped and sometimes complicated by encounters and interactions with people who were living in that place as well, our understandings and our misunderstandings of each other. So I began this study of place really 25 years ago or so, looking for the possibility of belonging where I felt I didn't belong, and I wanted the both and in identity, which at a very crude level at that stage was to be able to be both from a Protestant background and Irish. And in the process of writing this chapter and some other writing I've been doing lately, I've been coming to see that what I hadn't come to terms with in those early years of research was the both and of place. And I'd made some choices to move from one place to another place for a few reasons, but sometimes including a hope of identifying myself differently or finding a more secure sense of belonging, if not for myself, then for my children. So the idea that being rooted in one or another place could offer one or another identity. But because I ended up back in the place I most wanted to get away from, where I grew up, I had to revisit that kind of either or sense of it as a place. So I was settling there, my children were going to grow up there, and I had to think again about where I'd brought them and whether I could live there. And I ended up really seeing so much more cultural and natural richness in the place than I'd been able to see when I was younger. Partly due to my own prejudice and blindness, and partly due to that painstaking and fragile process of building peace that we've had for the last 25 years. So really writing this piece, I'm grateful for the opportunity to do it for lots of reasons, but partly as well because I think it moved me a little bit further along what I hope is a lifelong path of learning about place and people and myself, and learning to listen to and look at what's there, and exploring it and getting to know it and accepting being challenged and frustrated and sometimes infuriated and taking some joy in it as well, and accepting everything that is there. And that process for me is about the whole island, also Northern Ireland in itself, but again for me grounded in these little micro-geographies, so that very particular and tangible scale that you can begin to understand the place that you're in and the places that you go through. So in a place-by-place approach then maybe coming to understand more about these 6 counties and the island as a whole. And that process of understanding place ongoingly is also a process of understanding myself for me, ongoingly, and hopefully understanding others as well more and more, and then accepting all of it too. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here as well. And just like from this discussion, this is, I think, the joy and the pleasure of this handbook, that it brings together all those different disciplinary angles and approaches and perspectives. I'm coming from an Irish literature perspective or background. My chapter is on post-agreement drama, so I'm basically comparing two plays with each other in a rather close reading, I must say, which jars a bit with the general tenor, but I think my main thing of coming into it is to look at the post-agreement landscape and to look on the one hand, or to reclaim really the promise of peace, this ethics of hope that is there in the agreement in particular. Like it's been always like kind of like foregrounded or focused the paragraph 2 of the opening declaration of support, and to think about the kind of like dual temporalities.
The Public Record Office is now closed.
Right.
Please ensure all documents have been returned to the issue desk.
Good, and I will keep it short as well in the spirit of having a wine reception at the end of that. But it's basically this like kind of like pull on the one hand, looking at the tragedies of the past, and the other hand, this promise of a fresh start. This kind of like, yeah, like hope for the future. And I think art, in particular drama, and again the kind of like audience appeal and the kind of like immediacy as well, like novels take longer to produce, poetry is kind of like shorter in its reaction, short stories are like a little bit in between, but drama has this direct interaction with the audience and can really make us kind of aware of things, can make things seen and heard that we kind of like maybe overlook otherwise. And the plays are very ironic and sarcastic. It's Abby Spallon's Lolly Scott and Stacey Gregg's Shibboleth, which are both kind of like very much dealing with a lot of trauma and tragedy in this kind of like comic, sarcastic way, but they are still reclaiming this kind of like hope or fresh start for the future. So this is what kind of, yeah, my chapter is all about. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Graham Brownlow and I teach economics at the Business School at Queen's, and also of relevance until last year I was editor of Irish Economic and Social History. And my chapter is really about interpretation. John White's book, Interpreting Northern Ireland from 1990, which pointed out that there were, at that stage, 7,000 books and articles written about Northern Ireland. And he talks in that literature review written for the Ford Foundation a little bit about economics. And he starts by talking, basically cutting a long story short, saying, firstly, that the Troubles compounded the problems of the Northern Irish economy. And secondly, that had economic performance been better before 68-69, how things would have turned out would have been very different. So that's the starting point of my chapter. And then, mindful I'm competing for wine reception, so I will keep it brief. And there are equations in my presentation, not my chapter, that what I talk about is how violence altered not just the level of economic development in Northern Ireland, but altered its structure. And also I make the point that absent the Troubles, there were a lot of problems that would have faced Northern Ireland's economy. So we shouldn't just turn around and say it was all a result of the Troubles. Then what I do in the chapter, because I'm mindful that I'm also writing hopefully for economists, is I talk a bit about the sociology of economics and the economics profession. And mindful that I'm in an archive and have studied history as well, but teach economics because it pays the bills. One of the things I talk about archivally is what I call rational reticence. In other words, why did the economics get taken out of the story when, if you go into the archive, you see the economics in the story very early on. You see the British Army explain the role of economics in 1971. And I talk about the Current Cross report, 17-page report, often ignored, often not mentioned. One of the most vital reports ever written about Northern Ireland, in which Current Cross made the observation that essentially that if you believe that unemployment is a recruiting sergeant for paramilitarism, then there's a problem, because unemployment destroys investment. Investment and violence therefore feeds on itself. So the way to stop the downturn in investment, and hence the rise in unemployment that will act as recruiting sergeant for paramilitarism, is to stimulate the economy. Cairncross was, of course, selected by the Treasury, officially by the Northern Ireland government. It was actually selected by the Treasury. Why did they pick him? Because he had worked for the economic section during the Second World War, which planned the Allied bombing campaign. It was planned by economists. So it was a deliberate, throwback. Again, in the chapter I talk about the competition between the Northern Ireland Finance Corporation that's set up by the Cairncross report that leads to InvestNI today. It's traceable back to that agency. I talk about the competition and the debates between the Treasury and the Northern Ireland office. I talk about why Thatcherism was modified in response to the political situation, and most especially I talk a bit about business confidence and how there's actually a pressure from the business community not to discuss the impact that violence is happening on the economy, because it's seen by telling the truth you deter investment. So do you tell the truth or do you not tell the truth, essentially? So I talk about that in the chapter. Then I talk a bit about the economics profession. So basically the economics profession changes after 2001 in the way it treats terrorism and violence. Why is that? It's because the economics profession is an American-dominated profession, and after 9/11, how you treat terrorism in the literature changes. So I talk a bit about, and again, the numbers and the statistical studies of the violence in Northern Ireland before 9/11 and after 9/11, and yeah, it's suitably downbeat. But but anyway, please read it. Yeah, I'll hand over.
Thank you. My name is David Coyles. I'm an architect, and I teach and research in architecture at the Belfast School of Architecture, Ulster University. I just wanted to say first that I was delighted to be part of this collection. It's a really wonderful and varied collection with lots of diverse viewpoints. And to allay any fears that Laura might have had, I thought her and Morchin were really great editors to work with. And I think it's great that they allow people to bring their perspectives to the table. So my contribution was entitled Everyday Architectures of Territory and Division. And it focused on a few case studies in Belfast of what my research has called hidden barriers. Now, we're all aware of the peace walls in Belfast and how they segregate and divide people. They're very obvious, we can see them. So these hidden barriers are a little bit more problematic. They're made up of everyday bits of the built environment. Hospitals, offices, factories, schools. So much so that they almost hide in plain sight within the contemporary city. And although I'm an architect and not a historian, the research started off going through archives that were probably never meant to be discovered. And the history of the hidden barriers goes back really to two things unexpectedly coming together in the late 1970s that I was able to piece together from the archival research. So on the one hand, as all of us probably will know, in the late 1970s, the housing stock in Belfast was in terrible condition. It was regarded to be the worst housing stock in Western Europe. Lots of people didn't have working indoor plumbing and even functioning toilets inside. So the actual environmental standard across the city was really poor. Alongside that, you had what was a very urbanized conflict. It was probably one of the most recent urbanized conflicts. The British Army were used to working in the former colonies. They're in Belfast, and you have a conflict that's playing out. Everyday streets and houses are actually a theatre of conflict. So you have these two processes playing out at the same time, and so whenever the redevelopment programs that were sweeping across the UK in the late 1970s in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow, whenever they eventually came to Belfast to kind of right that wrong that was the environmental dilapidation of the city, the government sat back and thought, maybe here there's an opportunity to do something. Because historically there has been a lot of inequality in housing in Belfast. As we all know, in times of heightened political tension, there was a lot of sectarian intimidation and violence in housing areas in Belfast. I mean, typically, there was a lot more housing stock for displaced Protestant families to move to. So, not all, but many Protestant families fled Belfast altogether, leaving behind lots of sound houses, but unwanted. And then in Catholic areas where the same processes were playing out, there wasn't the same options for Catholics to move to other areas outside of Belfast, and they tended to retreat to a smaller number of enclaves within the inner city. So you had this bizarre situation in the late 1970s where, in one of the case studies I talk about in the chapter, you had 17 acres of abandoned housing in a Protestant area that had been boarded up right beside a densely overcrowded Catholic enclave where there were 5 or 6 families, in some cases living in one house. But you couldn't use those discarded or abandoned Protestant houses to address this overspill because they were still regarded as being Protestant territory. And in the archive files that which were confidential, that I discovered, they talk about it quite explicitly as being Protestant territory, but of course in the public-facing documents that would never have been something that was admitted. So the government had this dilemma: what do we do? We've got all of these houses sitting, we've got people clamouring to get into them, but if they move into them, all of a sudden you'll have perhaps a Catholic ghetto, as it was referred to, in an area that was once Protestant. So whenever the redevelopment plan swept across the city, and this was a very public process, a secret security committee was also formed to look at these plans before they got down to the sort of operational level and see how they might be tweaked and shaped in ways that benefited security policy. What the chapter tries to describe is that the security policy in this case wasn't really about stopping Catholics and Protestants fighting. It was about trying to protect those large Protestant areas from Catholic encroachment and maintaining the recognised lines of division between Catholic and Protestant areas, irrespective of the actual demand for housing in those areas. So that same committee actually gave birth to the peace walls. That was their initiative, those first permanent peace walls. But they also put in place this range of hidden barriers. Factories, offices, shops, roads, parks, all of these things that still exist within the city. But when you look at how they're deployed and how they line up with the peace walls that we all can see, what they actually do in most cases is they still protect those large, depopulated Protestant areas from ever being encroached by Catholic housing, and in many cases, in a complementary fashion, they actually contain those what are today very popular and overcrowded Catholic areas from ever getting any bigger. And the point, I suppose, that I'll finish on, that the chapter tried to make, is that there's lots of policy discussing the peace walls, and I know it hasn't been very successful, but they are very much on the policy radar, and there's no denying that they're there. But you can walk across Belfast, and as many of us have, and you could walk through and around these hidden barriers, and you wouldn't know that they exist. They still hide in plain sight and continue to divide and segregate areas with the same divisive intent as the peace walls do. That's a rather glum, should have had a good joke, but it's a rather glum way to finish, but thank you.